Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. Joe Frazier hit his prime during the golden age of boxing that began in 1967 when Muhammad Ali was stripped of his heavyweight title and ended in the 80s with the ascendancy of Larry Holmes and Mike Tyson. It was fueled largely by the very public and acrimonious rivalry between Frazier and Ali, which drove boxing viewership and the size of boxing purses to the highest levels ever. Glenn Lewis is Director of Journalism at York College and Professor of Print Journalism at CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism. In his new book, Sparring with Smokin' Joe, Joe Frazier's epic battles and rivalry with Ali, he offers new insights into Frazier's vulnerabilities, his feelings about Ali, and his treatment by the boxing establishment, and his life outside the ring. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here.
Glenn, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, I had always been a huge fan of Muhammad Ali. And during the time of the fight of the century and the rematch, and then the Thriller Manila, I followed those fights. I rooted for Ali. I really wanted him to kill Frazier, in those days, like everybody else who was sort of Vietnam draft age, at that point, in my 20s. And, but it was also what he represented outside of the ring. He represented what my age group was worried about: the anti-Vietnam War, rhetoric, the idea of having leadership in the Black community and feeling that people cared, and people who drew attention from media were speaking up. So I really, liked him for all those right things. When I had a chance to interview Joe, I was surprised by how much I liked him. I was surprised by how much he had to offer in insights to Ali and into the boxing establishment. And I started to see them both in a different light. And it became fascinating.
Okay, so in 1980, you spent some time at Joe Frazier's. He's in retirement now.
Right.
You're spending time with him at his gym in Philadelphia. What was the gym like?
Oh, it was fabulous. It was something out of a Damon Runyon, novel. It was amazing. But it was also a reflection of him. Everything was sort of like a working class sort of approach to boxing. Everything was sticking to the basics and hard work and grit and no nonsense. And everybody in that gym, whether he was a contender for the title or he was a 12-year-old kid who was learning how to box for the first time, was treated with a certain amount of respect and a certain amount of expectation. And I also, there was this sort of mentorship that was constantly going on. Joe and his son Marvis would walk around the gym and they would pay attention to the kids that were training next to the adults and to the amateur boxers as well as the professionals. And they sort of helped everybody and gave them what they needed. And I love that idea of looking at the individual and, the idea of mentoring. That seemed to be pretty special.
And these are basically kids from a lower income Black neighborhood of Philadelphia, correct?
Yeah, they took kids literally kids came in off of the street in the community, and they would allow them to train in the gym. You know, they had certain rules. You had to go to school, you had to do well, you had to, you know, you couldn't miss class to go and train. You know, you couldn't do any of those things. And they reinforced things on a regular basis.
At some point, you left the gym and went on the road with the Smokin' Joe Frazier Review
Yeah.
in a tour down south. This was sort of, as you described it, was sort of like a second or third tier act. They traveled by caravan because Joe was afraid of flying.
Right.
You know, he had a band of young white guys whose names he couldn't remember.
That's
We
right.
talk about the cheap motels, the junk food, the venues, I guess the VFW halls, small audiences. Southern whites actually turned out in larger numbers for Joe than Black audiences did, right?
Well, you know, that really showed the effects of Ali's rhetoric on Joe and on Joe's life. You know, Ali made a point during the promotion of the fights to address himself as the Black man's champion, and you know, sort of suggesting that he was a protector of the Black community. And by the same token, he called Joe the white man's champion and suggested that Joe had sold out his people, that Joe, you know, was an Uncle Tom, that Joe had catered to the white establishment. And it really wasn't true. I mean, this was Ali's version to make himself look better and to make his opponent look worse.
But white Southerners sort of embraced that, right?
Well, yeah, they did. And so did the Black Southerners as well. You know, look, this was 1980. There was still remnants of the Jim Crow South, you know, at that time. You know, there was still a certain amount of racist attitudes, you know, down south. And Joe wanted very much to play those poor Black venues so that his people, I mean, he grew up 100 miles from Augusta, Georgia, in rural South Carolina. And he wanted those people who were sort of his people to be able to come and see the show and touch base with him and to know that he has not forgotten them.
Okay.
And the thing that surprised me, where they appreciated him and they were, you know, in awe a little bit of him, you know, the fact that he was Joe Frazier, he was a heavyweight champ, a lot of them did not forget the rhetoric by Ali. And they were addressing some of those same issues during the show. They would call out certain things to him that he literally felt like, I thought I dealt with this 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And it was a constant reminder that Ali's campaign against him found a home in certain audiences.
Okay. Now the show, I have to say that your description of it reminds me of the spoof of the lounge entertainer on Saturday Night Live. Not the most professional show. In fact, James Brown showed up for one of the appearances and sort of suggested that he could give Joe some tips on how to improve his act. But we're gonna move on from that. It's the real theme of the book seems to be that how Frazier continued to nurse very deep wounds from his rivalry with Ali. As you said, he never really got over Ali calling him slow and ugly and a gorilla and an Uncle Tom. And he was hurt because he had actually defended Ali when Ali got his boxing license revoked.
That was true. I mean, look, they started out as really close friends. They worked out, early on, they worked out together. Ali went to the 1960 Olympics and won the light heavyweight championship, the gold medal. Joe went to the 1964 Olympics, won the heavyweight medal, and they had a common beginning. They had a common route to success, and they supported each other. They worked out together. They really were good friends. And I think that's what hurt Joe more than anything, was the idea that this was not just another boxer, but this was somebody that he trusted. This was somebody that he grew up in boxing, with, and this was one of his key supporters. And he said all these horrible things to him. Now, Ali claimed that it was necessary to say those things to create a tone of animosity to sell tickets, to promote the fight. Well, the truth of the matter was, and Joe used to point this out to me, and he obviously pointed out then to Ali, that those fights were sold out way in advance. And the fight of the century, when Ali first came back, their first fight was actually one of the biggest fights in history, and one of the biggest cultural events, not sporting events, cultural events in history. It was the first time that they had closed circuit television worldwide. They sold out Madison Square Garden. Tickets were at a premium. People were doing anything and everything they could to try and get tickets.
So your point is basically that Ali didn't have to do all of this.
He didn't have to do any of those things.
Okay. Right.
So then you have to ask yourself, if you didn't need to do those things to sell tickets, what was the purpose of doing all that?
Right.
And again, you got to remember, Ali felt that he was away. It had been 3.5 years since he boxed. He was back in the cultural mainstream and in the public eye for the first time in a while. And I think he felt that he had to reestablish himself as the man and as someone who is above the game.
Okay.
As far as politics.
I want to go on to what I think was one of the most dramatic points that you made, at least to me, which is that you felt that their second fight, which was not a title fight, but it was their second fight.
Frazier beat Ali in the first fight.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, in the fight of the century, the first fight, Frazier beat Ali,
right,
which put pressure on the boxing establishment to have Ali win the second fight, because he was the biggest thing in boxing. And if Joe beat him 2 fights in a row, he would literally not be viable for championship fights.
You suggest that the decision in the second fight, which then the decision went for Ali, that it was out of simple desperation, you say.
Joe used to complain about different things, and you took some things with a grain of salt. But when it came to the fights, he was pretty honest. In the Thriller in Manila, both men were exhausted at the end of the fight. Both men were totally drained. It was over 100 degrees in the arena, and Joe's eyes were closed, practically, puffed closed. Ali couldn't lift his arms anymore. So Joe's corner threw in the towel before the last round, but the truth was that Ali was going to quit also before the 15th round. He just didn't get a chance to do it yet. He was a few seconds away from quitting. So Joe was honest about saying Ali beat him up that fight. They were pretty evenly matched. But when it came to the second fight, when it came to the rematch, he kept insisting over and over again that he had been robbed.
And do you
And
think he was? Do you think he was robbed?
yes, I think he was. What happened was I finally decided that I owed it to Joe to look into this and to decide impartially as I could whether that was true or not. And one thing really strongly suggested that maybe he was right, and that was the two most respected sports columnists of the time was Red Smith, who wrote for the New York Times and had won a Pulitzer Prize, and Dave Anderson, who wrote for the New York Times and also won a Pulitzer Prize. And both of those men were at ringside for the fight. And after the fight, they both wrote columns about how they saw the fight. And it really surprised me when I checked it out that both men insisted that Joe had been robbed and that he indeed had won the fight.
Okay.
So at that point, I decided to take the rounds one at a time, analyze what had been said by the officials, analyze their fighting technique, the amount of punches delivered, how much damage was done in each round.
You concluded that Joe had won.
It was a close fight, but I concluded that he won something like 7-4, 1 even, or something like that.
Okay. So
And that would have changed Ali's legacy and Joe's legacy.
right, right. So these days, I mean, even after his death, Ali remains probably the most beloved athletic figure in the world globally.
No doubt about it.
And we still, people have fallen in love with the grandfatherly George Foreman from his TV commercials. But
Right.
Joe Frazier, do you think that he deserves more credit than he gets?
Yeah, he does. And look, he did some damage to himself as well. At the end of his career, he really had a hard time coming to grips, with Ali. Ali wanted to make up. He realized it was, not a good look for what he had done to Joe, and I think he felt some real affection for Joe too, and he wanted to make up. And there were a lot of instances where they were at different events, where they were both being honored, and different fights, and Joe refused to be in the same room with it, and then, at the Olympics, where Ali was the torch carrier and lit the Olympic flame, Joe was standing nearby and sort of said, too bad he didn't fall in,
Sort of,
that kind of.
Frazier's sort of a sad figure in retirement. He's overweight. Well, we're all overweight now, but the taxi show, the financial problems. He and his wife, I guess his high school sweetheart, got a divorce. A lot of health problems. The gym eventually closed. Was he and this resentment that he had been treated poorly by the establishment, the press, and by Ali. But was he a local hero though in Philadelphia?
Oh yeah, he was definitely a local hero in Philadelphia. And also something gets lost in that description, and that is the quality of the man. Joe had certain attributes that I really came to respect and really came to admire. One thing was he was incredibly resilient. No matter what he experienced as far as loss in the gym or loss outside of the gym, no matter what kind of slights he might have felt different times from the press, he would immediately rise above that. He had this saying, "It ain't nothing but a party," and basically he felt that no matter what kind of a loss he had to endure, he would be able to subsume that loss, get his mind right, get ready for a new challenge, get ready for a new situation, and he would snap back immediately. And there were a lot of times in these 40 years since, doing that interview where, I had some sort of loss in my own life, some sort of embarrassing situation, as can happen when you're dealing, with the media a lot. And I would channel Joe in a way. I would think, well, look, if Joe snapped back from all those things, this is not so bad. I could snap back to.
You just say, ain't nothing but a party, right?
Ain't nothing but a party.
What did you learn anything that surprised you?
Yeah. I learned how really wise Joe was. And let me say what I mean by that. He had, he doesn't have book learning. He just went to the 9th grade in school. It was a tough situation. He had to leave the South at the age of 15 and a half, 16 to head north. He was in, risking being badly beaten because of him standing up to certain people. And so his education got cut short. But he really had a lot of homespun wisdom, street wisdom and homespun wisdom. And he really read people and he read situations extremely well. And a lot of times we went to cover things or do things when we were traveling. I was a young reporter who probably, was in his 20s, and I thought that I was a lot smarter than I really was. And I thought I was a lot more sophisticated than I really was. And I thought, well, I have a handle on this and poor Joe doesn't, but it was really the other way around. Like one perfect example, we went to visit a white club and Joe was meeting with the owner of the club. And he was a guy who had been brought up in the South, who was right across from the Augusta National Golf Course. And the guy was really pleased to have Joe there. He was, he was just ecstatic. But every time he addressed him, he would call him boy. And, this went on, throughout like an hour and a half conversation. And I was like furious, for Joe. I was, so amazed that this guy was doing this. And I kept waiting for Joe to put the guy in his place. And he never really did. He went through the conversation. He was courteous. He said, yes, I'll perform at your club. And they made arrangements. And he walked out and he seemed like everything was fine. And when we got out of the club, I sort of said, what was that all? Why didn't you knock him out? Why didn't you kill him? Yeah, how could you let him call you boy? And Joe said, you don't understand the situation. You're a young man from the North, from New York, and you don't understand the culture here. And this is a man who grew up using certain terminologies, having a certain attitude. He didn't realize that he was being disrespectful to me. He didn't realize that he was talking to me in that way.
Right.
And he thought he was being respectful. And I had to go with the intent of the person, not what he said.
We're almost out of time. We have about a minute left, but I want to ask you, you actually sparred with Joe in the gym. And I'm very happy to see that you lived to be on this program.
Well,
what was really,
it was really funny. We were at we were at a hotel in Augusta, and I used to interview Joe for an hour every day. And we were out on his terrace, and his terrace was about the size of a boxing gym, of a boxing ring. And I foolishly asked Joe as the last question in the interview, I said, what is it like? What would it be like for me to get in the ring with like you or Ali, with a heavyweight champion? And he said, okay, put him up. And I said, no. And he said, no, put him up. And he started to go into the crouch, and Joe Frazier, spoken Joe Crouch, and he would, start to jab at me. And what amazed me was how incredibly quick he was. He took 2 quick diagonal steps forward and literally had me pinned in the corner of the ring, the corner of the terrace, and wound up throwing a punch, that stopped literally, a half an inch from my face. And he said, so that's what it's like being in the ring with me. And at that moment, I realized if he had connected, his hand was literally the size of my whole head. I realized if he had connected, he probably would have broken my neck.
Well,
So
I'm glad you didn't. I'm glad you
Yeah.
didn't, Glenn, and that you survived to write your book. And, I learned some things about Joe Frazier and about the boxing world that I didn't know, and I'm sure your readers will too. So we're out of time. I'd like to thank Lynn Lewis, Director of Journalism at York College and Professor of Print Journalism at CUNY's Craig Newmark School of Journalism, and author of Sparring with Smokin' Joe, Joe Frazier's Epic Battles and Rivalry with Ali. It's published by Rowman and Littlefield. And to learn about our upcoming shows, be sure to follow us on Twitter at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy.